The sound wasn't quite right. That was the first thing Commander Sarah Viper McKenzie noticed when Lieutenant David Holbrook's open palm connected with her cheek in front of 400 personnel packed into the base auditorium. The crack echoed through the cavernous space, bouncing off concrete walls and steel rafters like a gunshot in a cathedral. But underneath that sharp report was something else. A wet, meaty sound that suggested the impact had been harder than he'd intended, hard enough to split skin, hard enough to draw blood. For exactly 2.7 seconds, absolute silence reigned in Briefing Room Alpha. 400 sets of eyes locked onto the two figures standing center stage beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The lieutenant, chest puffed with righteous indignation, his hand still raised from the follow-through. The woman, smaller by 6 inches and 40 pounds, her head turned slightly from the impact, a thin line of crimson beginning to trace from the corner of her mouth down to her jaw. Then she turned back to face him, and Lieutenant Holbrook realized he had made the worst mistake of his life. Her movement was fluid, almost graceful, the way water flows around an obstacle or the way a blade slides from its sheath. No telegraphed windup, no visible strain, just a subtle shift in weight distribution that somehow transformed her from a civilian contractor receiving discipline into something else entirely, something predatory, something that knew exactly how to dismantle a human being joint by joint. The auditorium held its collective breath. Somewhere in the back rows, a chair creaked. Someone's boot scraped against concrete. The ventilation system hummed its eternal tune. But every other sound had been sucked out of the space, replaced by an electric tension that made the air itself feel dangerous. Lieutenant Holbrook opened his mouth to say something, probably another lecture about respect and chain of command and knowing your place. The words never came. What came instead was a movement so fast that most of the audience would later swear they hadn't seen it, only heard it. A wet pop followed by a scream that started high and desperate before cutting off abruptly as Lieutenant Holbrook hit the floor. His shoulders sat at an angle that shoulders were never meant to achieve. Before we continue with what happened next, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The morning briefing at Naval Base Norfolk was supposed to be routine. Standard operational update for the 400 personnel assigned to Joint Task Force Atlantic, delivered in the base's primary auditorium, a concrete cathedral built in the 1960s when function mattered more than form. The space could hold 500 bodies in uncomfortable metal chairs arranged in precise rows, facing a raised platform where officers delivered information that ranged from critical to mind-numbing. Commander Sarah McKenzie sat in the back corner of the auditorium, as far from the center of attention as the architecture would allow. She wore civilian clothes, khakis and a navy polo shirt that could have come from any department store. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No insignia, no rank indicators, nothing to suggest she was anything other than a contractor or civilian employee attending a mandatory briefing. She had perfected this appearance over 3 weeks of deep cover work. Everything about her presentation was designed to render her forgettable, another face in the crowd, another administrative body taking up space in meetings where real decisions were made by real military personnel. It was a performance she had mastered through necessity, refined through repetition, and deployed with surgical precision. The only thing that might have given her away was how she sat. Perfect posture without appearing rigid. Hands folded in her lap in a position that looked relaxed, but provided optimal reaction time. Eyes tracking movement throughout the room with the systematic attention of someone trained to catalog threats and exits and fields of fire. But these were subtle details, visible only to someone who knew what to look for. Most people saw what they expected to see, a civilian contractor trying not to fall asleep during another military briefing. Lieutenant David Holbrook commanded the podium like a man who had never questioned his right to be there. He was 28, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from graduating near the top of his Naval Academy class and earning early promotion through a combination of competence and political awareness. His uniform was immaculate. His delivery was crisp. His PowerPoint slides were properly formatted and appropriately classified. He was also, Sarah had determined over weeks of careful observation, selling classified tactical data to private military contractors. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Access logs that showed him downloading operational details he had no reason to view. Financial records that revealed deposits coinciding with intelligence leaks. Communication patterns that suggested coordination with external entities. Nothing definitive enough for a court-martial, but enough to justify this deep cover investigation. Sarah had been dead for 2 years, at least officially. Commander Sarah McKenzie had been killed during a classified operation in Syria. Her body recovered and buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The funeral had been well attended. The coffin had been heavy. The grief had been genuine. The woman sitting in the back of briefing room Alpha was someone else entirely, at least according to every database and personnel file that mattered. She was Jennifer Walsh, a logistics contractor with a boring background and unremarkable skills, cleared for basic administrative work and nothing more. The identity was bulletproof because it had been constructed by people whose job was making bulletproof identities for operators who needed to come back from the dead. As you can see from the quarterly readiness reports, Lieutenant Holbrook was saying, his voice carrying easily in the concrete space, our operational tempo has increased by 23% over the previous period. This puts additional strain on our logistics pipeline, which is why we've brought in additional civilian support to handle the administrative burden. His gesture was casual, encompassing the scattered contractors and civilian employees sprinkled throughout the military personnel. Sarah felt his gaze pass over her without pause, without recognition, without any indication that she represented anything more significant than another body filling a government contract. Perfect. The briefing continued for 40 minutes, covering deployment schedules and training calendars and budget allocations with the methodical thoroughness that military bureaucracy demanded. Sarah listened with half her attention, while the other half cataloged details that might prove relevant later. Who sat where? Who paid attention to what? Who checked their phones when they thought no one was looking? Holbrook commanded the room with easy authority, fielding questions and providing clarifications with the kind of competence that made his suspected crimes all the more damaging. He was good at his job, which made him dangerous. Good officers who went bad understood the system well enough to exploit it effectively. Before we conclude, Holbrook said as the briefing wound toward its end, I want to address something that's been brought to my attention regarding operational security protocols. The shift in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Less informational, more disciplinary. Sarah's attention focused completely on the podium. It's come to my notice that some personnel, both military and civilian, have been accessing systems and files outside their designated areas of responsibility. This is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. His eyes swept the room, lingering on certain faces. When his gaze reached Sarah, it paused for just a moment longer than random chance would suggest. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to send a message. He knew. Somehow, despite her perfect cover and careful operational security, Lieutenant David Holbrook had identified her as a threat. The question was how much he knew and what he intended to do about it. Operational security is everyone's responsibility, Holbrook continued, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. But it's particularly important for civilian contractors to understand the boundaries of their access and to respect the chain of command that keeps this installation running smoothly. The words were general enough to apply to anyone, but Sarah felt them land like targeted accusations. She maintained her neutral expression, giving no visible reaction to what amounted to a public warning. But internally, she was recalculating threat assessments and contingency plans. If Holbrook suspected her true identity, he would move quickly to neutralize the threat. He couldn't risk exposure, not when millions of dollars in illegal payments were at stake. The question was whether he would act officially, filing reports and launching investigations, or whether he would try something more direct. I want to be absolutely clear about this, Holbrook said, his voice hardening slightly. Anyone found accessing classified material without proper authorization will face immediate consequences. Anyone found conducting unauthorized investigations will be removed from this facility and prosecuted to the fullest extent of military and civilian law. The threat was barely coded now. He was speaking directly to her, using the briefing as cover for what amounted to a personal warning. The audacity was impressive in its own way. Using an official military briefing to threaten a federal investigator required a level of arrogance that suggested either supreme confidence or complete desperation. "Are there any questions about operational security protocols?" Holbrook asked, his gaze sweeping the room one final time. Silence stretched across the auditorium. 400 people sat motionless, sensing tension they didn't understand, but recognizing its presence nonetheless. The air itself felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm when atmospheric pressure drops and every nerve ending anticipates lightning. Sarah considered her options. She could remain silent, maintain her cover, continue the investigation through careful observation and patient evidence gathering. Or she could force the issue, accelerate the timeline, see how far Lieutenant Holbrook was willing to push this confrontation. She raised her hand. The gesture was simple, unremarkable, the kind of thing that happened in briefings every day. But something about the quality of her movement, the controlled precision of the motion, caused a ripple of attention throughout the room. Conversations that had been whispering toward resumption died completely. Personnel who had been gathering their things froze in position. "Yes?" Holbrook's voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see tension in his shoulders, wariness in his eyes. "I have a question about the access logs you mentioned," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the concrete space. "Specifically, I'm curious about the correlation between file access patterns and operational security breaches over the past 6 months." The question was innocuous on its surface, the kind of technical inquiry a contractor might reasonably ask about system security. But underneath the bland language was a precision-guided missile aimed directly at the heart of Holbrook's operation. Because Sarah knew exactly what those access logs revealed. She knew about the downloads that occurred at 0347 hours when the building was supposed to be empty. She knew about the correlation between Holbrook's file accesses and subsequently compromised operations. She knew about the money. Holbrook's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't think that level of detail is appropriate for this forum," he said, his tone suggesting the question was both irrelevant and inappropriate. "Of course," Sarah replied, with the kind of deference that civilian contractors were expected to show military officers. "Perhaps we could discuss it after the briefing. I'd be happy to walk through the data I've compiled." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. She was telling him, in front of 400 witnesses, that she had data, that she had been compiling information, that she knew enough to ask dangerous questions. Holbrook's response would tell her everything she needed to know about how far this confrontation would escalate. "I think that would be educational," he said finally, the word carrying undertones that suggested education of a very specific and unpleasant variety. "Why don't you join me on stage? We can address your questions publicly, since operational security affects everyone here." The invitation was a trap. Sarah understood that immediately. By calling her to the podium, Holbrook was isolating her from the crowd, putting her in a position where she would be physically vulnerable and psychologically exposed. Whatever he planned to do next, he wanted her front and center when it happened. She could decline. Make some excuse about not wanting to take up everyone's time. Suggest they handle it privately later. Maintain her cover and her position in the back of the room where exits were accessible and witnesses were abundant. But that would mean backing down. And Commander Sarah McKenzie, dead or alive in uniform or in khakis, operating under her real name or a carefully constructed alias, had never backed down from anything in her life. She stood slowly, deliberately, and began walking toward the front of the auditorium. Every step felt measured and significant. Her boots, practical low-profile hiking boots that looked civilian but had steel toes and reinforced ankle support, struck the concrete floor with a rhythm that somehow commanded attention. Personnel in the aisle seats tracked her movement, sensing, without understanding, that something important was happening. The walk from the back of the auditorium to the front platform took exactly 43 seconds. Sarah counted each one, using the time to run final calculations about what was about to occur and how she would respond. By the time she reached the steps leading to the podium, she had made her decision. Lieutenant David Holbrook was about to learn the difference between threatening a civilian contractor and threatening a Navy SEAL. The platform at the front of Briefing Room Alpha was designed to accommodate multiple speakers with enough space for a podium, projection screen, and several chairs for panel discussions. Under normal circumstances, it would have felt spacious, professional, appropriate for the kind of routine military briefings that happened here multiple times per week. But as Sarah stepped onto the raised platform, the space contracted around her and Lieutenant Holbrook like a boxing ring. The auditorium fell absolutely silent. 400 pairs of eyes focused on the two figures now sharing the stage. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter up here, more unforgiving, casting sharp shadows and eliminating any possibility of anonymity. Holbrook had positioned himself behind the podium, using the wooden barrier as both physical and psychological protection. From his perspective, this was his territory, his briefing, his rules. He had called her forward to demonstrate control, to show the assembled personnel that challenges to his authority would be met with swift and public correction. Sarah stopped exactly 6 feet from the podium, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain reaction space. Her posture appeared relaxed, hands loose at her sides, weight evenly distributed. To most observers, she looked like a civilian contractor trying not to appear nervous in front of hundreds of military personnel. But anyone with combat experience would have recognized her stance as something else entirely, the ready position of someone prepared for immediate violence. "Now then," Holbrook said, his voice projecting across the auditorium with the kind of authority that came naturally after years of command experience. "You mentioned having data about access logs and security patterns. I'm sure everyone here would be interested in hearing what a civilian contractor has discovered that our security professionals might have missed." The words were delivered with just enough condescension to make clear that he considered her concerns amateurish at best, potentially subversive at worst. A few scattered chuckles rippled through the audience, junior officers eager to demonstrate their loyalty to a superior who was publicly dressing down an overreaching contractor. "Well?" Holbrook prompted when Sarah didn't immediately respond. "We're all waiting?" Sarah took a slow breath, her eyes never leaving his face. When she spoke, her voice was level and professional, carrying clearly without being raised. "Lieutenant Holbrook, I've been reviewing the digital forensics data from your personal computer access over the past 90 days. The pattern analysis shows 47 instances of you accessing classified operational files that fall outside your stated areas of responsibility." The auditorium went dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. This wasn't a question anymore. It was an accusation, and it was being made publicly in front of hundreds of witnesses by someone who apparently had access to data she shouldn't possess. Holbrook's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally a kind of cold fury that suggested he had moved beyond caring about subtlety or plausible deniability. "That's an extremely serious accusation," he said, his voice dropping to a register that somehow managed to fill the entire space despite being barely above a whisper. "The kind of accusation that could end someone's career. The kind of accusation that could result in federal charges for unauthorized access to classified systems." He stepped out from behind the podium now, closing the distance between them. His movement was deliberate, predatory, designed to use his physical size as intimidation. At 6'3" and 220 pounds, he towered over her, using every inch of that advantage to project dominance. "What I'm wondering," he continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "is how a logistics contractor gained access to digital forensics data that would require security clearances she doesn't possess. Unless, of course, our Ms. Walsh isn't quite who she claims to be." The name hung in the air like an exposed wire. Jennifer Walsh, the identity she had been living under for 3 weeks, suddenly felt paper thin under the weight of his scrutiny. He knew, perhaps not everything, but enough to be dangerous. "I think," Holbrook said, stepping closer still, now within arm's reach, We need to discuss exactly who you are and what you're really doing on this base. Sarah could feel the moment crystallizing around them, becoming the kind of incident that would be analyzed and discussed for years afterward. She had perhaps 3 seconds to decide how this played out, maintain her cover, and try to extract herself from an increasingly compromised position, or drop all pretense and see where the confrontation led. The decision was made for her when Lieutenant Holbrook reached out and grabbed her upper arm with enough force to leave bruises. "You're coming with me," he said, his grip tightening. "We're going to have a private conversation about your credentials and your authorization to access classified systems. And depending on what you tell me, we'll decide whether this ends with your immediate removal from the base or your arrest on federal charges." The grab was a mistake, a significant one. Sarah's body reacted before her mind had fully processed the threat, muscle memory and years of training taking over in the space between one heartbeat and the next. But she controlled the response, channeling it into something that looked like civilian confusion rather than military precision. She stumbled slightly, pulling against his grip, her free hand coming up in what appeared to be an instinctive defensive gesture. "Lieutenant, you're hurting me," she said, her voice carrying just enough distress to suggest genuine civilian panic. "I don't understand what's happening." It was a performance, carefully calibrated to maintain her cover while testing how far meaty was willing to escalate. The grab had been bad enough, assault on a federal agent, even one operating under deep cover. But if he continued, if he used more force or made more explicit threats, she would have legal justification for responding with appropriate measures. "What's happening?" Holbrook said, his grip shifting higher on her arm, finding pressure points with the kind of precision that suggested he'd done this before. "Is that you've been caught conducting unauthorized surveillance on military personnel. What's happening is that you're about to face consequences for whatever game you've been playing here." His free hand came up, not quite threatening, but positioned where it could become threatening very quickly. The gesture was designed to intimidate, to make clear that he was prepared to use physical force if necessary to maintain control of the situation. The auditorium watched in fascinated horror as the confrontation escalated beyond anything they had expected from a routine briefing. Personnel shifted in their seats, uncertain whether they should intervene, whether this was some kind of planned demonstration, whether they were witnessing something that would require incident reports and formal investigations. "I need you to let go of me," Sarah said, her voice still maintaining the careful modulation of someone trying to de-escalate without appearing weak. "This is inappropriate. Whatever questions you have can be answered through proper channels." "Proper channels?" Holbrook's laugh was harsh and without humor. "You've been snooping through classified systems for weeks, probably feeding information to whoever's paying you, and you want to talk about proper channels?" His grip tightened further, fingers finding nerve clusters with practiced efficiency. Sarah's arm began to go numb, circulation being systematically cut off by someone who clearly understood human anatomy well enough to inflict pain without leaving obvious marks. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued, his voice dropping back to that dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the auditorium. "You're going to tell me exactly who you are, who you work for, and what information you've compromised. And depending on how cooperative you are, I might let you walk away from this instead of spending the next 20 years in federal prison." The threat was explicit now, delivered in front of hundreds of witnesses with no attempt at subtlety or plausible deniability. Lieutenant Holbrook had committed fully to this course of action, banking on his authority and her apparent vulnerability to intimidate her into compliance. It was his second mistake. The first had been grabbing her. The second was assuming that intimidation would work. Sarah looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the confrontation began. Her expression shifted subtly, the carefully maintained mask of civilian confusion falling away to reveal something else underneath. Something harder, something that had seen combat and death and betrayal and survived all of it. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, her voice now carrying undertones that suggested this conversation was about to change direction in ways he had not anticipated. "I need you to let go of my arm. Right now." The words were delivered with such calm precision that several personnel in the front rows leaned forward involuntarily, recognizing the tone even if they couldn't identify its source. It was the voice of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed, the voice of someone who understood violence intimately and was prepared to deploy it if necessary. Holbrook felt the shift too, his expression flickering with the first hint of uncertainty. But he'd committed too far to back down now, his reputation and his freedom both dependent on maintaining control of this situation. "You're not in a position to make demands," he said, though something in his voice suggested he was no longer entirely convinced of that statement. That was when Sarah smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting patiently for an excuse to stop pretending, someone who had been holding back enormous potential energy and was finally being given permission to release it. "Actually," she said, her voice now completely different, clear, authoritative, carrying the unmistakable ring of command authority, "I am." The transformation was instantaneous and total. The woman who had been standing there moments before, confused civilian contractor Jennifer Walsh, simply ceased to exist. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone whose posture and presence and projected authority filled the platform despite her relatively small physical stature. Lieutenant Holbrook felt the change like a physical force. His grip on her arm loosened involuntarily as his brain tried to process what had just happened. The woman he had been intimidating, the contractor he had been threatening, had somehow become something else, something dangerous. "What?" he started to say, but the word died in his throat as Sarah moved. The motion was economical and precise, targeting specific points on his anatomy with surgical accuracy. Her free hand came up in what looked like a defensive gesture, but landed with devastating effect on pressure points in his wrist and forearm, causing his grip to release completely as nerve pathways temporarily shut down. Before he could react or recover, she had stepped slightly to the side and taken control of the arm that had been holding her, applying leverage with the kind of technical precision that spoke to extensive training in close-quarters combat. Lieutenant David Holbrook, who had spent the morning delivering briefings and threatening civilian contractors, found himself being bent forward at an uncomfortable angle, while someone significantly smaller than him applied just enough pressure to make clear that resistance would result in broken bones. "Lieutenant," Sarah said conversationally, as if they were discussing something as mundane as the weather, "you're under arrest for violation of federal espionage statutes, specifically the unauthorized disclosure of classified information to foreign entities." The words echoed across the stunned auditorium like gunshots. 400 personnel sat in absolute silence, trying to process what they were witnessing. The routine briefing had transformed into something none of them had been prepared for. "You have the right to remain silent," Sarah continued, maintaining her grip on Holbrook's arm while delivering the Miranda warning with the kind of practiced ease that suggested she had done this many times before. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Holbrook tried to struggle, his face red with pain and humiliation. "You can't arrest me," he managed to gasp. "You're a civilian contractor. You have no authority." "Actually," Sarah interrupted, reaching into her pocket with her free hand, "I'm Federal Agent Sarah McKenzie, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and you, Lieutenant, have been under investigation for the past 3 months. She produced a leather credential case, flipping it open to display a gold badge and federal identification that gleamed under the harsh auditorium lights. The credentials were authentic, current, and carried the kind of authority that superseded military rank when federal crimes were involved. "Special Agent McKenzie?" Holbrook's voice cracked slightly as the implications crashed over him. "But you're dead. I saw the funeral footage. You died in Syria." Sarah's smile widened slightly, though it remained entirely without warmth. "Reports of my death," she said, "have been greatly exaggerated." The platform fell silent again, as 400 people tried to comprehend what they were witnessing. A dead federal agent had just arrested a Navy lieutenant for espionage charges, and somehow this was happening in the middle of a routine Tuesday morning briefing. But Lieutenant Holbrook, perhaps driven by desperation or simply poor judgment, decided to make one final attempt to regain control of the situation. His free hand came up fast, palm open, swinging toward the side of Sarah's face with enough force to knock her backward and break her control hold. It was a move born of panic rather than strategy, the kind of wild swing that might work against someone who wasn't expecting violence. Sarah had been expecting violence since the moment she'd stepped onto the platform. The slap never landed. Instead, Holbrook found his attacking arm caught mid-swing, his momentum redirected with mechanical precision, his body following a trajectory that he had not chosen and could not control. The sound that echoed through the auditorium was wet and final, the distinctive pop of a shoulder joint separating from its socket, followed immediately by a scream that started high and desperate before cutting off as Lieutenant Holbrook hit the concrete floor. 400 people sat in perfect silence, staring at the two figures on the platform, one standing, calm and in complete control, one on the ground, clutching his dislocated shoulder and making small sounds of pain. Special Agent Sarah McKenzie looked out at the assembled personnel and spoke with the kind of quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. "Base security to briefing room Alpha," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. "Federal arrest in progress. Medical personnel to the same location for treatment of non-life-threatening injuries." Then she looked down at Lieutenant Holbrook, who was struggling to sit up while cradling his ruined shoulder. "For the record," she said conversationally, "assaulting a federal agent during the course of an investigation carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. That's in addition to the espionage charges." She paused, considering his prone form with the kind of clinical interest a scientist might show when examining an interesting specimen. "You should have taken the plea deal we offered 6 months ago." The silence in briefing room Alpha stretched for exactly 17 seconds after Lieutenant Holbrook hit the floor. Sarah counted each one while her eyes swept the auditorium, cataloging reactions and calculating threat assessments. 400 faces stared back at her, expressions ranging from shock to confusion to the kind of fascinated horror that people display when witnessing car accidents in slow motion. Then, the whispers started. "Holy shit, did you see that? She just destroyed him. Who the hell is she really? Federal agent? I thought she was just a contractor. Did she say NCIS? How's that possible?" The murmurs built like gathering storm clouds, individual voices merging into a collective buzz of disbelief and speculation. Personnel leaned toward each other, sharing observations and theories in hushed tones that somehow managed to fill the cavernous space with electric energy. Sarah remained motionless on the platform, her posture relaxed but ready, one hand resting casually on Lieutenant Holbrook's shoulder to discourage any thoughts of escape or further resistance. Her credentials case lay open on the podium, the gold badge catching fluorescent light and throwing fractured reflections across the concrete walls. The doors at the back of the auditorium burst open with military precision. 6 members of base security entered in formation, weapons holstered, but hands positioned for immediate access. Behind them came 2 medical technicians carrying equipment bags and wearing expressions that suggested they'd responded to stranger calls but couldn't immediately remember when. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez led the security team, his weathered face betraying no surprise at the scene before him. 23 years of military service had taught him to expect the unexpected, and a federal agent arresting a Navy lieutenant barely registered on his scale of unusual incidents. "Special Agent McKenzie," he called out as his team spread across the back of the auditorium in standard crowd control formation. "Base security responding to your request. What's your status? If hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one." "Situation contained, Master Chief," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly across the silent auditorium. "1 suspect in custody, minimal injuries, approximately 400 witnesses to federal arrest proceedings." She gestured toward Holbrook, who had managed to work himself into a sitting position despite his dislocated shoulder. His face had gone pale from pain and shock, beads of sweat forming along his hairline as the reality of his situation began to penetrate the fog of adrenaline and confusion. "Lieutenant Holbrook has been arrested on federal charges related to unauthorized disclosure of classified information," Sarah continued. "He'll require medical attention for a dislocated shoulder before transport to holding facilities." The medical technicians approached the platform with professional caution, uncertain whether the situation had truly stabilized or might explode into violence again without warning. The senior medic, a hospital corpsman named Patterson, had seen enough combat injuries to recognize the particular angle of Holbrook's shoulder joint. "Sir, I need to examine your injury," Patterson said, kneeling beside the lieutenant with the kind of calm efficiency that came from years of treating wounded personnel under less than ideal circumstances. "Can you tell me your pain level on a scale of 1 to 10? "Fuck your scale," Holbrook gasped, sweat now streaming down his face. "That bitch dislocated my shoulder. I want her arrested for assault on a military officer." The demand echoed across the auditorium, and Sarah saw several personnel shift uncomfortably in their seats. The psychology of the situation was complex. Many of them had served under Holbrook, respected his competence, followed his orders. Watching him reduced to cursing and making demands from the floor created cognitive dissonance that would take time to resolve. "Lieutenant," Master Chief Rodriguez said, his tone carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of dealing with difficult situations and difficult people, "I need you to remain calm while medical personnel assess your condition. Any further statements should probably wait until you've consulted with legal counsel." It was good advice, delivered with the wisdom of someone who had seen careers destroyed by words spoken in moments of stress and pain. But Holbrook was beyond listening to good advice. "I don't need legal counsel," he snarled, trying to struggle to his feet despite Patterson's attempts to keep him still for examination. "I need someone to arrest this woman for impersonating a federal agent and assaulting military personnel." Sarah reached into her pocket and produced a second set of credentials, these ones bearing the seal of the Department of Defense and classification markings that indicated special access authorization. She held them up for Rodriguez to examine. "Master Chief, I'm operating under direct authority of the Secretary of the Navy for investigation of classified information breaches within Joint Task Force Atlantic. Lieutenant Holbrook has been under surveillance for the past 90 days as part of a joint FBI-NCIS operation targeting espionage activities." Rodriguez examined the credentials with the thoroughness of someone who understood that authenticity mattered and forgery was a federal crime in its own right. The documents appeared genuine, complete with holographic seals and verification codes that could be checked against federal databases. "These look legitimate," he said finally, "but I'll need to verify through command channels before we can proceed with transport." "Of course," Sarah nodded. "I'll provide my case officer's contact information for immediate verification. This needs to be handled through proper channels to preserve the integrity of ongoing federal investigations." The exchange was professional and procedural, exactly the kind of bureaucratic dance that military personnel understood instinctively. But underneath the calm official language was a current of tension that everyone in the auditorium could feel. Lieutenant Holbrook represented something more than just one corrupt officer. If the allegations were true, if he had been selling classified information for months or years, then the breach of security extended far beyond his individual actions. Other personnel might be involved, other operations might be compromised, the entire command structure might need to be examined and potentially restructured. "Ma'am," Patterson said, looking up from his examination of Holbrook's shoulder, "I need to relocate this joint before transport. It's going to hurt and he might lose consciousness." "Do what you need to do," Sarah replied. "Just be aware that the subject has demonstrated a propensity for violence and should be considered a flight risk despite his injury." Patterson nodded and began preparing for the shoulder reduction, a procedure that involved manipulating the joint back into its proper position through controlled application of force. It was painful under the best circumstances, excruciating when performed in a concrete auditorium in front of hundreds of witnesses. "Lieutenant, this is going to hurt significantly," Patterson warned. "I need you to try to stay still and breathe through it." "Just fucking do it," Holbrook gasped, his earlier defiance giving way to resignation and pain. The sound of the joint snapping back into place was audible throughout the auditorium. A wet pop followed by Holbrook's sharp intake of breath and a low moan that suggested the pain was exactly as intense as predicted. Several personnel in the front rows looked away, uncomfortable with witnessing what felt like an intimate moment of suffering. "That's better," Patterson said, his voice carrying professional satisfaction. "Range of motion is restored, though you'll need to keep it immobilized for several days and follow up with orthopedics. Any numbness or tingling in your fingers?" Holbrook flexed his fingers experimentally, testing sensation and motor function. "No," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from pain and stress. "It feels better." The medical emergency had provided a brief respite from the larger drama, a few minutes of focus on immediate physical needs rather than the complex legal and security implications of what had occurred. But as Patterson finished securing Holbrook's arm in a sling, the weight of the situation began to reassert itself. "Special Agent McKenzie," Rodriguez said, "I've contacted Base Command and they're verifying your credentials through official channels. In the meantime, I need to ask about the disposition of these personnel." He gestured toward the 400 people still sitting in stunned silence, uncertain whether they were witnesses to a federal investigation, participants in a security briefing, or simply unfortunate bystanders caught up in events beyond their control. Sarah considered the question carefully. The arrest had been necessarily public. Holbrook's challenge had forced her hand, and attempting to maintain her cover identity would have compromised the entire operation. But having 400 witnesses to a federal arrest created its own complications. "Everyone present has witnessed the arrest of a military officer on federal espionage charges," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. "This is an ongoing investigation with national security implications. I need everyone to remain in their seats while we sort through immediate security concerns." A hand shot up from the middle of the auditorium. Sarah nodded toward the questioner, a young ensign who looked like he was struggling to process what he'd witnessed. "Ma'am, are you really dead? I mean, officially dead? Because we all heard about the Syria operation and the funeral at Arlington." The question was direct and reasonable, the kind of thing that anyone would ask when confronted with someone who was supposed to be deceased. Sarah had been prepared for this moment, had rehearsed explanations and cover stories and official responses. But standing on the platform, looking out at 400 faces that reflected confusion and curiosity and the kind of trust that military personnel placed in their chain of command, she decided on honesty. "Ensign, my death was staged as part of a deep cover operation targeting espionage activities within military command structures. The funeral was real. The grief was real. But the body in that coffin belonged to someone else who had died serving their country and deserved proper honors." The explanation was clinical and factual, stripped of the emotional weight that surrounded faked deaths and assumed identities and the psychological costs of letting everyone you cared about believe you were gone forever. "For the past 2 years, I've been operating under various cover identities to investigate security breaches that were getting American personnel killed in the field. Lieutenant Holbrook represents one node in a larger network that we've been mapping and dismantling, piece by piece." Another hand raised, this time from a senior petty officer whose gray hair and lined face suggested decades of service. "Agent McKenzie, how many other people on this base are under investigation?" It was exactly the question that everyone was thinking but hadn't been willing to ask. If Holbrook was compromised, if there was a network of espionage activity, then anyone could be suspect. Trust, the foundation of military effectiveness, became a liability when security was compromised at the command level. "I can't discuss the specifics of ongoing investigations," Sarah replied. "But I can tell you that Lieutenant Holbrook's arrest represents significant progress in identifying and neutralizing threats to operational security. The investigation will continue until we're confident that all compromised personnel have been identified and appropriate action has been taken." The response was carefully worded to provide reassurance without revealing operational details. But the implication was clear. Holbrook was not the only target, and the investigation would continue until everyone involved had been identified and prosecuted. Lieutenant Holbrook, who had been sitting quietly while medical personnel attended to his shoulder, suddenly looked up with an expression that suggested he had reached some internal decision. "You want to talk about networks?" he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium with surprising strength. "You want to talk about who else is involved?" Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense. This was the moment that could break the entire operation wide open or destroy months of careful investigation through premature revelations and contaminated evidence. "Lieutenant," she said carefully, "I strongly advise you to consult with legal counsel before making any statements about ongoing federal investigations." But Holbrook was beyond listening to advice or considering consequences. The pain medication that Patterson had administered was beginning to take effect, lowering his inhibitions and reducing his capacity for strategic thinking. "Colonel Morrison knows," he said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "He's been facilitating transfers for 18 months. Captain Webb has been providing operational schedules. Chief Ramirez has been copying communication protocols." Each name landed, like a physical blow. These were senior personnel, people with access to the most sensitive information on the base, people whose betrayal would compromise not just current operations, but potentially years of strategic planning and intelligence gathering. Sarah's mind raced through implications and contingencies. Holbrook's uncontrolled confession was providing intelligence that would have taken months to develop through traditional investigation, but it was also compromising active surveillance operations and potentially alerting other suspects to the scope of federal interest. "Master Chief," she said urgently to Rodriguez, "I need immediate communications with base command. We have multiple suspects who need to be secured before they can destroy evidence or flee the jurisdiction." Rodriguez was already reaching for his radio, understanding without explanation that the situation had escalated beyond a single arrest into something resembling a counterintelligence crisis. But before he could establish communication, the doors at the back of the auditorium opened again, this time admitting 3 figures whose presence changed the atmosphere in the room completely. Colonel Morrison entered first, his uniform immaculate and his bearing suggesting someone accustomed to command authority. Behind him came Captain Webb, a thin man with nervous eyes, and Chief Ramirez, whose bulk and scarred hands spoke to decades of technical work and supervisory responsibility. They walked down the center aisle with the kind of confidence that suggested they were responding to a routine emergency call, 3 senior personnel arriving to assess and manage whatever crisis had developed during the morning briefing. Sarah watched their approach with growing certainty that the situation was about to become significantly more complicated. Because if Lieutenant Holbrook's confession was accurate, then 3 of the people walking toward the platform were part of the espionage network she had been investigating for 2 years, and they had just walked into a room where their co-conspirator was in federal custody, and their operations had been exposed in front of 400 witnesses. The moment when they realized what was happening would determine whether this ended with a coordinated surrender or a desperate attempt to eliminate the evidence, including the federal agent who had been systematically dismantling their operation for the past 90 days. Sarah's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the concealed weapon she carried, a movement so subtle that only someone trained in combat observation would have noticed. The 3 officers continued their approach, their expressions shifting from professional concern to confusion, to something that looked very much like dawning horror as they processed the scene on the platform. Their co-conspirator in custody, a federal agent with exposed credentials, and 400 witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Colonel Morrison reached the front of the auditorium first, his eyes moving from Holbrook's restrained figure to Sarah's federal credentials to the security personnel positioned throughout the room. "What exactly is happening here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate answers and complete compliance. Sarah met his gaze directly, her own voice calm and level, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Colonel Morrison," she said, "you're under arrest." The words hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance, dangerous and unstable and capable of destroying everything within their blast radius. Colonel Morrison's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, denial, calculation, and finally a kind of cold fury that suggested he had moved beyond caring about subtlety or consequences. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice dropping to the register that senior officers used when their authority was being challenged in ways they considered unacceptable. "Agent McKenzie, I think you've exceeded your jurisdiction here." Behind him, Captain Webb had gone pale, his nervous eyes darting between the exits and the security personnel who had positioned themselves to control movement throughout the auditorium. Chief Ramirez remained motionless, his expression unreadable, but his hands had moved to a position that suggested he was calculating distances and reaction times. Sarah stepped down from the platform, moving with the kind of controlled precision that put her within engaging distance of all three suspects, while maintaining clear lines of sight to the security personnel positioned around the room. "Actually, Colonel," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent auditorium, "my jurisdiction extends to any military installation where federal crimes have been committed. And according to Lieutenant Holbrook's statement, which was delivered in front of 400 witnesses, you've been facilitating the unauthorized transfer of classified information for the past 18 months. Morrison's jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. Years of command experience had taught him to control his reactions, to project authority even when facing challenges to that authority. "Lieutenant Holbrook is obviously suffering from stress-related mental breakdown," he said dismissively. "His statements have no credibility and certainly don't constitute evidence of any criminal activity." It was a reasonable response, the kind of thing that might work under normal circumstances. But these circumstances were anything but normal, and Sarah had been preparing for this confrontation for months. She reached into her jacket and produced a tablet computer, its screen displaying what appeared to be financial records and communication logs. The data was organized chronologically, color-coded by source and cross-referenced in ways that suggested extensive analysis and correlation. "Colonel, I have bank records showing deposits to offshore accounts that correlate directly with classified information breaches. I have communication intercepts that show coordination between you and foreign intelligence services. I have digital forensics evidence that traces specific file transfers from your personal computer to external networks." Each piece of evidence landed like a physical blow. Morrison's controlled expression began to crack as the scope of the federal investigation became clear. This wasn't a fishing expedition or a case built on suspicious behavior and circumstantial evidence. This was a comprehensive intelligence operation that had been documenting his activities with scientific precision. "Captain Webb," Sarah continued, turning her attention to the thin officer who looked like he wanted to disappear into the concrete floor. "Your role in providing operational schedules has been fully documented. Every schedule you've leaked has been correlated with subsequent attacks on American forces. We have the bodies counted, Captain. We know exactly how much your information has cost." Webb made a small sound, something between a cough and a sob. His hands were shaking visibly now, and his face had taken on the gray pallor of someone who understood that their life as they knew it was about to end. "Chief Ramirez," Sarah said, completing the triangle, "your communications protocols ended up in the hands of terrorist organizations who used them to intercept and decode American military communications. The blood on your hands is measured in the dozens." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. 400 people sat motionless, witnessing the systematic destruction of 3 military careers and the exposure of security breaches that threatened national safety. The weight of the revelations pressed down on everyone present like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Morrison was the first to recover, his military training reasserting itself as he calculated options and assessed threats. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that had been honed through decades of command experience. "Agent McKenzie," he said, "I think we should discuss this matter privately. There are classification issues that shouldn't be addressed in front of unauthorized personnel." It was a reasonable request, the kind of thing that might work if everyone present accepted his authority and agreed to move the discussion to a more controlled environment. But Sarah had been anticipating exactly this response. "Colonel, everyone in this auditorium has appropriate security clearances for their assigned duties. More importantly, your co-conspirator has already made public statements that have compromised any classification concerns. We're well past the point where this can be handled quietly." Morrison's hand moved toward his sidearm, a subtle shift that Sarah tracked with peripheral vision while maintaining eye contact. Around the room, security personnel tensed, recognizing the movement and preparing for potential violence. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action," Sarah said quietly. "You're facing espionage charges, which carry significant penalties but aren't capital crimes. Drawing a weapon on a federal agent in front of 400 witnesses would change that calculation considerably." The warning was delivered with clinical precision, laying out consequences without threats or emotional appeals. Morrison's hand paused, hovering near his weapon while his mind processed risk assessments and probability calculations. Behind him, Captain Webb seemed to reach some internal decision. His shoulders sagged as years of stress and guilt finally overwhelmed his capacity for deception and resistance. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice barely audible but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent auditorium. "It's been over since she walked onto this base. We just didn't know it yet." The admission broke whatever resolve Morrison had been maintaining. His hand moved away from his sidearm as the reality of their situation penetrated his military training and command authority. "How long?" he asked, his voice hollow. "How long have you known?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The truth was complex, involving multiple agencies and years of investigation, and the kind of patient intelligence work that built cases piece by piece over extended periods. "We identified the first indicators of compromise 26 months ago," she said. American forces were being ambushed with tactical precision that suggested real-time intelligence. Operations were failing because enemy forces knew exactly when and where to position themselves for maximum effectiveness. She paused, letting the implications settle across the room like poison gas. It took 8 months to isolate the source of the leaks to this installation. It took another 6 months to identify the specific personnel involved, and it took 12 months to document everything thoroughly enough to ensure successful prosecution. The timeline was devastating in its implications. For over 2 years, these 3 men had been selling information that resulted in American deaths, and for most of that time, federal agencies had been watching, documenting, building cases with the patience of scientists studying dangerous specimens. "The funerals," Morrison said suddenly, understanding flooding his voice. "You attended funerals for operators who died because of information we provided." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something cold moved behind her eyes. 17 funerals, Colonel. I attended 17 funerals for American service members who died because you sold their operational details to enemy forces. I stood with their families and listened to eulogies and watched coffins lowered into the ground, knowing that their deaths were preventable and that the people responsible were still walking free. The words hung in the air like a judgment, and Morrison physically recoiled as if he'd been struck. The abstract concept of espionage, selling information for money, had suddenly become concrete in the form of specific deaths and grieving families and flag-draped coffins. "We didn't know," Webb said desperately. "We never knew that people were dying because of what we did. They told us it was just intelligence gathering, strategic assessment. They never said people would get hurt." Sarah turned her attention to him, her expression suggesting she'd heard similar justifications before and found them unpersuasive. "Captain, did you think classified operational information was being purchased for academic research? Did you believe enemy forces were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for strategic assessments they planned to file away and never use?" The questions were clinical, designed to strip away the comfortable lies that Webb had been telling himself for months. His face crumpled as the willful ignorance that had allowed him to function was systematically dismantled. "I needed the money," he whispered. "My wife's medical bills. The treatments weren't covered by insurance. I just needed enough to pay for her care." It was a human reason, the kind of motivation that made headlines and generated sympathy in newspaper articles. But it was also the reason that had gotten American soldiers killed, and that reality hung over his explanation like a death sentence. "Chief Ramirez," Sarah said, turning to the third member of the conspiracy. "What was your excuse?" Ramirez had remained silent throughout the confrontation, his weathered face betraying no emotion as his co-conspirators were systematically broken down. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of resigned acceptance that suggested he'd been preparing for this moment for months. "No excuse," he said simply. "I did it because they offered money and I wanted money. No sick wife, no desperate circumstances, no patriotic justification. Just greed." The honesty was somehow more disturbing than Webb's desperate rationalization or Morrison's implicit denial. Ramirez had sold information that killed American personnel because he wanted to be wealthy, and he was admitting it with the straightforward directness of someone who had moved beyond shame or justification. "How many others?" Sarah asked, directing the question to all three men. "How many other personnel are involved in this network?" The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Morrison and Webb exchanged glances, engaging in some kind of wordless communication. Ramirez stared straight ahead, his expression suggesting he was done cooperating and done caring about consequences. "Answer the question, Colonel," Sarah said, her voice carrying new edges of authority and impatience. "How many other people on this base have been compromised?" Morrison seemed to be weighing options, calculating whether cooperation might earn him consideration during sentencing or whether silence might preserve some slim chance of avoiding conviction. 12, he said finally. 12 other personnel have provided information or facilitated transfers over the past 18 months. The number hit the auditorium like a physical force. 12 additional people meant that nearly every department and security level had been compromised. It meant that the corruption had spread through the base like an infection, touching critical systems and essential personnel. "Names," Sarah demanded. "I need names in specific roles." Morrison looked around the auditorium, his eyes moving across faces that he recognized, personnel who had served under his command and trusted his leadership. Some of them were probably on his list. Some of them were sitting in this room, listening to their commander prepare to destroy their lives and careers. "I want immunity," he said suddenly, "full immunity from prosecution in exchange for complete cooperation and detailed information about the entire network." It was a reasonable request from his perspective, the kind of plea bargain that federal prosecutors offered to mid-level criminals in order to reach higher-value targets. But Sarah's response suggested that he had misunderstood his position in this particular food chain. "Colonel," she said with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever, "you are the higher-value target. You organized this network, recruited the participants, and coordinated the intelligence transfers. We don't need your cooperation to prosecute the others because we've been documenting their activities independently for months." The statement demolished Morrison's negotiating position completely. He had assumed that his information was valuable enough to trade for leniency, but the federal investigation had been comprehensive enough to make his cooperation useful rather than essential. "But," Sarah continued, "cooperation during sentencing phase might influence the judge's decision about whether you spend 25 years in federal prison or 30. That's the only deal available." Morrison's face went through several more emotional transitions as he processed the reality of his situation. No immunity, no plea bargain, no negotiation. Just the choice between cooperation that might earn him a slightly shorter sentence or silence that would accomplish nothing except satisfying his pride. "Security to all departments," Sarah said, speaking to Rodriguez while maintaining eye contact with the three suspects. "I need immediate detention for 12 additional personnel. I'm sending their names and locations to your tablet now." She manipulated her own device, transmitting information that had been compiled and verified over months of surveillance and investigation, names and positions and evidence packages that would support immediate arrests and prevent any opportunity for evidence destruction or flight from jurisdiction. "Special Agent McKenzie," Rodriguez said, examining the list that had appeared on his screen. "These are senior personnel across multiple departments. Arresting 12 people simultaneously is going to create significant operational disruption." It was a reasonable concern, the kind of practical consideration that military personnel dealt with every day. Removing 12 senior people simultaneously would create gaps in leadership and expertise that might compromise the base's ability to function effectively. "Master Chief," Sarah replied, "this base has been compromised at every level for the past 18 months. Operational disruption is preferable to continued security breaches that are getting American personnel killed in the field." The logic was unassailable, though the implications were staggering. Joint Task Force Atlantic would essentially need to be rebuilt from the ground up, with new leadership and new security protocols, and a complete review of everything that had been compromised during the period of penetration. The auditorium remained silent as personnel processed the magnitude of what was being revealed. This wasn't just about 3 corrupt officers or even 12 compromised personnel. This was about the systematic failure of security systems that were supposed to protect the most sensitive military information. "Attention all personnel," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. "What you've witnessed here today is the culmination of a 2-year federal investigation into espionage activities that have compromised American military operations and resulted in the deaths of American service members." She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle before continuing. "Over the next several hours, you'll see additional arrests as we complete the dismantling of this espionage network. You'll see operational changes as command structures are rebuilt with personnel who haven't been compromised, and you'll see security reviews of every system and protocol that might have been affected by 2 years of intelligence penetration." The scope of the changes was overwhelming. Personnel who had worked together for years would be separated and investigated. Operations that had been planned and executed would be reviewed for compromise. Trust, the foundation of military effectiveness, would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. "Most importantly," Sarah continued, "you'll see justice for the American personnel who died because classified information was sold to enemy forces. Every person involved in this network will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law." She looked directly at Morrison, Webb, and Ramirez, her expression carrying the weight of 17 funerals and 2 years of investigation, and the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from complex cases finally reaching resolution. This is what accountability looks like. The mass arrests began exactly 47 minutes after Sarah's revelation in Briefing Room Alpha. Throughout Joint Task Force Atlantic, security teams moved with coordinated precision, executing simultaneous detentions that had been planned for months and triggered by a single encrypted message from Sarah's tablet. In the communications center, Chief Petty Officer Martinez was pulled away from his monitoring station while intercepted enemy communications he had been providing decryption keys for, played on speakers throughout the facility. In supply, Lieutenant Commander Harrison was arrested while standing next to shipping manifests that documented equipment lost to accounting errors, but actually diverted to foreign purchasers. In intelligence, Major Phillips was taken into custody, surrounded by the very classification protocols he had been systematically violating for over a year. Each arrest revealed another layer of the conspiracy, another thread in a web that had taken federal investigators 2 years to map completely. The scope was staggering. Senior personnel across every critical department, compromising everything from operational planning to equipment procurement to secure communications. But the arrests were only the beginning. Sarah stood in the base commander's office, watching through reinforced windows as personnel in handcuffs were loaded into transport vehicles under heavy security escort. Behind her, Admiral Patricia Chambers, the base commander who had been kept ignorant of the federal investigation for operational security reasons, struggled to process the magnitude of betrayal that had occurred under her command. 26 months, Admiral Chambers said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "This network operated under my nose for 26 months, and I never suspected anything." Sarah turned from the window, her expression sympathetic but professional. The personal cost of command failure was something she understood intimately, though her own failures had been measured in different terms. "Admiral, the penetration was sophisticated and carefully managed. The personnel involved were chosen specifically because they had established records of competence and loyalty. The behavioral changes were subtle and occurred gradually over extended periods. Even experienced counterintelligence professionals might have missed the indicators." The reassurance was genuine, but limited in its comfort. Command responsibility was absolute in military culture, regardless of mitigating circumstances or reasonable explanations. Admiral Chambers would carry the weight of this failure for the rest of her career, just as Sarah had carried the weight of Syria and the decision to fake her death and spend 2 years hunting the people who had sold American lives. "How many died?" Chambers asked quietly. "How many American personnel died because of information leaked from my base?" Sarah consulted her tablet, pulling up casualty reports that had been compiled over months of correlation analysis between intelligence breaches and subsequent attacks on American forces. Bide, 63 confirmed deaths directly attributable to information provided by this network, she said, reading from data that had been verified by multiple agencies and cross-referenced against operational timelines. Another 147 wounded, an unknown number of local nationals who were providing intelligence to American forces and were subsequently identified and eliminated. The numbers landed like physical blows. Admiral Chambers sank into her chair, the weight of command responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a crushing burden. 63, she repeated. 63 families who will never know that their loved ones died because people they trusted sold their operational details for money. Sarah nodded grimly. The operational security around the investigation had been absolute, which meant that most of the families would never learn the true circumstances of their losses. They would carry their grief without understanding that betrayal rather than battlefield chance had determined their tragedy. Admiral, Sarah said, there's something else you need to know about the scope of this operation. Chambers looked up, her expression suggesting she wasn't sure how much more devastating information she could process in a single morning. The intelligence that was sold from this base wasn't just used to target American forces, Sarah continued. It was packaged and resold to multiple organizations, including terrorist groups who used it to plan attacks on civilian targets in allied nations. She manipulated her tablet, displaying a web of connections that showed how information stolen from Joint Task Force Atlantic had been distributed through networks of buyers and brokers and ultimately used to plan attacks on civilian infrastructure, government facilities, and population centers. The London transport bombing last year, the embassy attack in Kenya, the airport assault in Brussels, all of them incorporated intelligence that originated from leaks at this facility. The implications were staggering in their scope. What had begun as a criminal conspiracy involving a few corrupt military personnel had evolved into something approaching crimes against humanity, with consequences that reached across continents and affected thousands of civilian casualties. Jesus Christ, Chambers whispered. How many people died because of this base? How many attacks succeeded because we couldn't keep our own secrets? Sarah closed her tablet, setting aside the data that documented the full scope of human cost. Numbers were necessary for prosecution and investigation, but they became overwhelming when viewed as individual tragedies and destroyed families. Admiral, I need you to understand something important about the next phase of this operation, she said, her tone shifting from informational to operational. The arrests we've made today represent the domestic component of this network, but the foreign elements, the buyers and brokers, and ultimate recipients of this intelligence are still active. Chambers frowned, processing the implications. You're saying this isn't over. I'm saying that dismantling the source doesn't eliminate the distribution network, Sarah replied. We've cut off the supply of new intelligence, but the people who purchased information from your personnel are still operating. They still have operational plans based on American tactical procedures. They still have identities of intelligence assets. They still have enough compromised information to threaten American interests for years to come. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Master Chief Rodriguez entered, his expression grim but professionally controlled. Agent McKenzie, Admiral, he said, nodding to both women. I have an update on the detention operations. Report, Admiral Chambers said, straightening in her chair and reassuming command authority despite the circumstances. 12 arrests completed without incident, Rodriguez said. All subjects are in custody and have been informed of their rights. No resistance, no attempts to destroy evidence, no communications with external parties that we've detected. He paused, consulting notes on his tablet before continuing. However, we have a complication with the evidence recovery. Several of the subjects had implemented sophisticated data destruction protocols that activated automatically when their computers were accessed by unauthorized users. We've recovered some information, but significant portions of their files have been permanently destroyed. Sarah cursed quietly. Data destruction was always a risk with sophisticated criminal operations, but the timing suggested that someone had triggered the protocols remotely, which meant that external elements of the conspiracy were aware that the domestic network had been compromised. How much intelligence do we estimate has been lost? She asked, Rodriguez checked his notes again. Preliminary assessment suggests that approximately 60% of stored communications and financial records have been destroyed. Digital forensic specialists are attempting recovery, but the destruction appears to have been thorough and professionally executed. The news was frustrating, but not unexpected. Criminal organizations that operated at this level of sophistication understood the importance of operational security and contingency planning. They would have prepared for the possibility of law enforcement penetration and developed protocols to minimize damage when the inevitable occurred. "What about the financial trail?" Admiral Chambers asked. "Can we trace the money flow to identify foreign contacts?" Sarah shook her head. The payments were processed through multiple layers of shell companies and cryptocurrency exchanges. We've identified some of the intermediate steps, but the ultimate sources appear to be intelligence services that understand financial operational security, as well as we do. It was another dead end, another layer of professional sophistication that suggested the foreign elements of this conspiracy were significantly more dangerous than typical criminal organizations. They understood American investigative capabilities and had structured their operations to minimize exposure when domestic assets were inevitably discovered and prosecuted. "Ma'am," Rodriguez continued, "there's one more thing. During the arrest of Lieutenant Commander Harrison, he made some statements that suggest this network extends beyond personnel currently assigned to this base." Sarah's attention focused completely on Rodriguez's report. Network expansion was always a concern with espionage investigations, but the implications of broader penetration could be catastrophic. "Explain," she said tersely. "Harrison claimed that personnel at other installations have been recruited and are providing similar intelligence. He mentioned Naval Base San Diego, Norfolk Naval Station, and Marine Corps Base Quantico specifically. The locations represented some of the most sensitive military installations in the United States. If the conspiracy had successfully penetrated multiple bases simultaneously, then the scope of intelligence compromise could affect virtually every aspect of American military operations." "Did he provide specific names or details?" Admiral Chambers asked. "Negative," Rodriguez replied. "He made the statements during initial processing, but then requested legal counsel and stopped cooperating. We have his claims on record, but no corroborating information." It was standard criminal behavior. Provide just enough information to suggest cooperation while withholding specific details that could be verified independently. Harrison was probably hoping to trade information for reduced sentences during plea negotiations. "Admiral," Sarah said, "I need to contact my task force leadership immediately. If this network has penetrated multiple installations, then we're looking at a counterintelligence crisis that requires immediate federal coordination." Chambers nodded, understanding the implications without requiring detailed explanation. Multiple compromised bases meant that operational security for the entire military had been breached at fundamental levels. "Agent McKenzie," she said, "you have my complete cooperation and whatever resources this base can provide, but I need to ask you something directly." Sarah waited, recognizing the tone that suggested a question that had been weighing on the Admiral's mind throughout their conversation. "How did you do it?" Chambers asked. "How did you fake your death convincingly enough to fool everyone, including people who knew you personally? How did you maintain deep cover for 2 years while building a case this comprehensive?" The questions were reasonable, but touched on aspects of the operation that Sarah had been avoiding since her cover identity had been blown in the auditorium. The personal cost of deep cover work was something that federal agencies understood intellectually, but rarely discussed in operational terms. "Admiral," Sarah said carefully, "the decision to stage my death wasn't made lightly. It required extensive planning and coordination between multiple agencies. It required letting everyone who cared about me believe that I was gone forever, including family members who grieved at my funeral." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The psychological cost of deep cover work is significant. You become someone else so completely that you sometimes forget who you were originally. You watch people you care about move on with their lives, accepting your death and learning to function without you. You attend briefings about operations where people discuss the tragic loss of personnel they don't realize are sitting in the room." The explanation was clinical, but couldn't capture the full emotional weight of the experience. Sarah had attended 3 memorial services for herself, listening to eulogies and watching colleagues honor her memory while she sat in the back row wearing civilian clothes and a disguise that made her unrecognizable to people who had served with her for years. But the alternative, she continued, was allowing this espionage network to continue operating while American personnel died in the field. The choice between personal sacrifice and professional duty wasn't really a choice at all. Admiral Chambers nodded slowly, recognizing the kind of dedication that defined the best military personnel regardless of their specific service or assignment. "Agent McKenzie," she said, "when this is over, when the prosecutions are complete and the security reviews are finished, I want to recommend you for the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. What you've accomplished here goes beyond law enforcement. You've prevented a catastrophic breach of national security." The offer was generous and well-intentioned, but Sarah's response suggested that recognition was not a priority compared to completing the mission. "Admiral, I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm still officially dead according to most military records. Medal ceremonies for deceased personnel tend to raise uncomfortable questions." It was delivered with dark humor, but the underlying issue was serious. Sarah's legal status was complex, involving classified authorities and special access programs that existed in the gray areas between military and civilian law enforcement. "Besides," she continued, "this case isn't closed until we've identified and neutralized the foreign elements of this network. The domestic arrests are just the first phase." Rodriguez's radio crackled with incoming communication, interrupting the conversation. He listened briefly, then looked up with an expression that suggested new developments. "Agent McKenzie," he said, "I'm getting reports of unusual activity at multiple off-base locations, vehicles leaving private, residences at high speed, cell phone communications that suggest coordination between unknown parties, and at least 3 attempted international flights that were scheduled within the past hour." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Rapid departure patterns suggested that external elements of the conspiracy had been alerted to the arrests and were implementing escape protocols. "How many people?" she asked. "Unknown," Rodriguez replied, "but the activity pattern suggests at least a dozen individuals who may be connected to the network and are attempting to flee the jurisdiction." The news confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The espionage network hadn't been entirely domestic, and the foreign elements had been monitoring their American assets closely enough to detect when the operation was compromised. "Admiral," Sarah said urgently, "I need immediate coordination with FBI, CIA, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We have potential flight risks who may be attempting to reach non-extradition countries with critical intelligence about American operations." Chambers reached for her secure phone, understanding that the next few hours would determine whether 2 years of investigation resulted in complete success or partial failure, with significant ongoing security implications. "Agent McKenzie," she said while dialing, "what do you need from this base to support federal coordination?" Sarah considered the question quickly, running through resource requirements and operational priorities. "I need secure communications with my task force leadership, helicopter transport to coordinate with field teams, and immediate access to base intelligence systems to cross-reference known contacts and associates of the arrested personnel." Each requirement represented a critical capability for managing a rapidly expanding counterintelligence operation that had moved beyond the original scope of the investigation. "Done," Admiral Chambers said, then spoke into her phone with the kind of authority that made things happen quickly. "This is Admiral Chambers, Joint Task Force Atlantic. I need immediate secure connection to FBI Assistant Director Morrison, CIA Deputy Director Patterson, and ICE Operations Center. Priority Alpha classification, national security emergency." As she spoke, Sarah pulled out her own secure communication device, preparing to coordinate with federal agencies that had been standing by for exactly this eventuality. The arrests at Joint Task Force Atlantic had been planned as the trigger for a coordinated operation that would attempt to roll up the entire espionage network before external elements could escape or implement contingency plans. But successful coordination required precise timing and flawless execution, and the early warning that external elements had received meant that the operation was already behind schedule and potentially compromised. The next few hours would determine whether 2 years of investigation and personal sacrifice had been sufficient to protect American national security, or whether the most dangerous elements of the conspiracy would escape to continue their operations from safer jurisdictions. Outside Admiral Chambers's office windows, helicopters were lifting off from the base flight line, carrying federal agents and intelligence analysts to coordinate pursuit operations across multiple states. The investigation that had begun with suspicious casualty patterns in overseas operations was about to culminate in a manhunt that would test the capabilities of every major federal law enforcement and intelligence agency. Sarah checked her weapon and communication equipment, preparing for what might be the final phase of the longest and most complex undercover operation of her career. The hunt was about to begin. The temporary command center had been established in a secure conference facility 3 miles from Joint Task Force Atlantic, where representatives from FBI, CIA, NSA, ICE, and military intelligence could coordinate without compromising ongoing operations at the base itself. Banks of monitors displayed real-time intelligence from across the eastern seaboard, flight tracking data, financial transaction records, communication intercepts, and surveillance footage from airports and border crossings. Sarah stood in front of the primary display screen, her civilian contractor disguise replaced by tactical gear that marked her as the federal agent she had always been. Around her, 24 of the nation's most experienced counterintelligence professionals worked with the focused intensity of people who understood that the next few hours might determine whether a critical national security operation succeeded or failed. "Status report," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the controlled chaos of the command center. Special Agent David Chen, FBI counterintelligence specialist, looked up from his workstation where multiple data streams were being analyzed and correlated in real time. "We have positive identification on 11 individuals who departed the Norfolk area within 4 hours of the base arrests," he reported. 7 of them attempted to board international flights. 4 were successful before we could implement detention protocols. The numbers were better than Sarah had feared, but worse than optimal. 7 detention attempts suggested that most of the external network had been identified and located quickly. 4 escapes meant that critical intelligence about American operations was about to reach hostile foreign governments. "Destinations?" she asked. Chen consulted his screen, pulling up flight manifests and passenger records that had been flagged by automated analysis systems. 2 flights to Moscow via connecting flights through Frankfurt, 1 direct to Beijing, 1 to Dubai with ultimate destination unknown, but probably Iran or Pakistan. Each destination represented a different intelligence service and a different set of threats to American national security. The Moscow flight suggested Russian intelligence involvement. Beijing indicated Chinese intelligence penetration. Dubai was a hub for multiple Middle Eastern intelligence services that had complex relationships with American interests. "What about the 7 we detained?" Sarah asked. CIA analyst Maria Santos answered from her position at the Intelligence Correlation Workstation, where she had been matching detained individuals against known foreign intelligence databases. 3 are confirmed foreign intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, she reported. 2 are American citizens with extensive foreign travel histories and financial connections to known intelligence fronts. 1 is a foreign national here on an academic visa who appears to have been coordinating financial transfers. 1 is still being processed, but preliminary indicators suggest another American citizen who was recruited for ideological rather than financial reasons. The profile was typical of sophisticated espionage operations, a mixture of professional intelligence officers, recruited assets, and useful idiots who provided cover and compartmentalization for the core conspiracy. "Have any of them started talking?" Sarah asked. Santos shook her head. "All have invoked their rights to legal counsel and are refusing to answer questions. The 3 with diplomatic status are claiming immunity and demanding immediate contact with their embassies. It was standard operating procedure for captured intelligence officers, but it meant that information about the broader network would have to be developed through technical means rather than cooperative interrogation. "What about financial intelligence?" Sarah asked, turning to Treasury Department analyst Rebecca Torres, who had been tracking money flows and financial relationships throughout the investigation. "We've identified approximately $12.7 million in payments that flowed through the network over the past 2 years," Torres reported. The money originated from at least 6 different sources, suggesting that the intelligence was being sold to multiple buyers rather than a single foreign service. The information confirmed what Sarah had suspected. This wasn't a traditional espionage operation focused on supporting one national intelligence service. It was a commercial operation that sold American intelligence to anyone willing to pay, regardless of their ultimate intentions or relationships with American interests. "Can you trace the ultimate sources?" Sarah asked. Torres manipulated her display, showing a complex web of financial transactions that had been routed through dozens of intermediate accounts and shell companies. "Partial success," she said. "We've identified 3 of the 6 sources: Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, Chinese Ministry of State Security, and what appears to be Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Intelligence Division. The other 3 sources are still being analyzed, but the transaction patterns suggest at least one Middle Eastern government and possibly 2 terrorist organizations." The scope was staggering and confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the case. American intelligence hadn't just been sold to foreign governments, it had been provided to terrorist organizations that used it to plan attacks on civilian targets. "Agent McKenzie," FBI Assistant Director James Morrison called from the command desk where he had been coordinating with federal agencies across the country. "We need to discuss next phase operations." Sarah approached the command desk, where Morrison and CIA Deputy Director Patricia Patterson were reviewing operational plans that would determine how the investigation proceeded beyond the immediate crisis response. "Agent McKenzie," Patterson said, "the intelligence we've recovered suggests that this network was part of a larger operation targeting multiple military installations across the United States. We need to decide whether to continue with overt arrests and prosecutions or whether to implement covert monitoring to identify additional cells before they become aware of our investigation." It was the classic counterintelligence dilemma: strike immediately to prevent further damage or wait and watch to develop intelligence about broader threats that might be even more dangerous. Sarah considered the options, weighing the risk of continued intelligence compromise against the potential value of identifying unknown threats. "How confident are we that we've identified all the domestic personnel involved in this specific network?" she asked. Morrison consulted his briefing materials. "High confidence for Joint Task Force Atlantic, moderate confidence for the other installations that Lieutenant Commander Harrison mentioned, low confidence for installations he might not have known about." The assessment suggested that immediate action was necessary to prevent further compromise, even if it meant losing the opportunity to identify additional threats through continued surveillance. "Sir," Sarah said, "I recommend immediate overt action against all suspected personnel at all potentially compromised installations. The intelligence that's already been compromised is sufficient to threaten American operations for years. We can't allow additional leaks while we attempt to identify unknown threats." Patterson nodded slowly. "I concur with that assessment. Agent McKenzie, we're implementing coordinated operations at 8 additional military installations within the next 6 hours. You'll be coordinating the naval facilities while FBI handles Army installations and CIA manages Air Force and Marine Corps facilities." The scope of the operation was unprecedented in recent counterintelligence history. Simultaneous raids at 9 major military installations, with the potential for dozens of arrests and the complete restructuring of operational security protocols across multiple service branches. "Ma'am," Sarah said, "I'll need transport to Norfolk Naval Station within the next 2 hours to coordinate that operation personally." "Already arranged," Morrison replied. "Helicopter transport in 90 minutes. You'll have a full federal team for operational support and local base security for logistical assistance." The conversation was interrupted by urgent communication from the Financial Intelligence Workstation. Torres was waving for attention while speaking rapidly into her headset. "Agent McKenzie," she called out, "we have new developments on the financial intelligence front." Sarah approached Torres's workstation, where multiple screens displayed transaction records and correlation analyses that had been updated in real time as new information became available. "What do you have?" Sarah asked. "The account that was used to pay Lieutenant Colonel Morrison received a large deposit 4 hours ago," Torres reported. "Someone transferred $2.3 million into his offshore account after the arrests at Joint Task Force Atlantic." The timing was impossible to explain as coincidence. Someone with detailed knowledge of the espionage network had made a significant financial transfer after the American assets had been compromised, which suggested either payment for services rendered or compensation for sacrificing American personnel to protect the broader operation. "Can you trace the source of this payment?" Sarah asked. Torres manipulated her display, following the digital trail of the transaction through multiple intermediate accounts. The payment originated from an account controlled by Pacific Development Associates, which is a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, she said. "PDA has been used for multiple transactions with known intelligence fronts, but this is the largest single payment we've detected." Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. A $2.3 million payment suggested that Morrison hadn't been a recruited asset being paid for intelligence. He had been a paid employee of a foreign intelligence operation that valued his services highly enough to provide significant compensation even after his cover had been blown. "How much money has Morrison received from this source over the investigation period?" Sarah asked. Torres consulted her records. Total payments from PDA and associated entities, $7.2 million over 26 months. That makes him one of the highest paid intelligence assets in the database. The amount was staggering and suggested that Morrison had been providing intelligence that was extraordinarily valuable to foreign interests. It also suggested that the foreign elements of the conspiracy considered him valuable enough to compensate even after his arrest, which might indicate plans for prisoner exchanges or other post-arrest operations. "Agent McKenzie," Patterson called from the command desk, "we need you to review the operational plan for Norfolk Naval Station before departure." Sarah moved back to the command area, where detailed blueprints and personnel rosters were displayed on multiple screens. Norfolk Naval Station was one of the largest military installations in the world, with over 75,000 personnel and responsibility for a significant portion of the Atlantic Fleet. "The potential compromises at Norfolk are more extensive than what we found at Joint Task Force Atlantic," Patterson explained. "We're looking at possible penetration of ship schedules, deployment plans, operational communications, and possibly nuclear submarine operations." The implications were catastrophic. Norfolk Naval Station supported operations that were critical to American strategic defense, including nuclear-powered submarines that carried ballistic missiles and attack submarines that provided intelligence gathering and power projection capabilities. "How many suspect personnel?" Sarah asked. Morrison answered, reading from intelligence summaries that had been compiled over the past 6 hours. 18 confirmed suspects based on financial intelligence and communication intercepts, potentially 37 additional personnel who had access to compromised information and showed suspicious behavioral patterns. The numbers suggested that the Norfolk operation would be significantly larger and more complex than the morning's arrests at Joint Task Force Atlantic. "Agent McKenzie," Patterson said, "I need to ask you directly. Are you prepared to lead an operation of this scope after spending 2 years undercover and managing the stress of a complex federal investigation?" It was a reasonable question. Deep cover operations took psychological tolls that could affect judgment and decision-making, particularly when the stakes were as high as they were for the Norfolk operation. Sarah considered her response carefully. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and operating on adrenaline that had been sustaining her for months. But she was also the federal agent who understood this case better than anyone else, and the Norfolk operation would require that institutional knowledge to succeed. "Ma'am," she said, "I'm the only person who has complete operational knowledge of how this network functions. The Norfolk operation needs someone who understands the behavioral patterns and operational security measures that these suspects have been using. I can handle the stress." Patterson nodded, accepting the assessment while noting the signs of fatigue that Sarah couldn't completely conceal. Very well, she said. But I'm assigning Deputy Assistant Director Collins as your operational partner for Norfolk. You'll have command authority, but he'll provide backup decision-making if the stress becomes overwhelming. It was a reasonable compromise that provided Sarah with the support she might need while ensuring that operational knowledge wasn't lost if she became incapacitated. Understood, Sarah replied. When do we depart? Morrison checked his coordination schedule. Helicopter departure in 45 minutes. The Norfolk operation commences at 600 tomorrow, coordinated with simultaneous operations at 7 other installations. Sarah nodded and moved toward the equipment area to prepare for what might be the final phase of the longest counterintelligence operation of her career. But as she gathered her gear and reviewed operational plans, a nagging concern continued to grow in the back of her mind. The $2.3 million payment to Morrison after his arrest suggested that the foreign elements of this conspiracy were implementing contingency plans that hadn't been anticipated by federal investigators. Someone was still operating, still coordinating, still managing assets and operations, even after the domestic network had been compromised, and that someone had access to millions of dollars and the sophistication to transfer money undetected through international banking systems. The arrests at Joint Task Force Atlantic had been successful, but they might have been only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous operation. The domestic network has been rolled up, but foreign elements are still operational and implementing escape plans that suggest this conspiracy reaches higher and deeper than anyone suspected. The Norfolk operation will be the final test of whether 2 years of sacrifice and investigation have been sufficient to protect American national security, or whether the most dangerous threats are still out there, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget.